Good morning. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, good morning, journalists. Good morning, members of the financial community and members of the PIOJ community. Welcome to our quarterly press briefing. On behalf of the team, may I apologize for our short delay, but at this time, we're going to hand right over to Mrs. Marcia Blake Hall, who will be the chairperson for the meeting.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thanks for joining us at the Planning Institute of Jamaica's quarterly press briefing. Today, the Director General, Dr. Wayne Henry, will report on the performance of the economy for the January to March 2021 period. He will be supported by Mr. James Stewart, Senior Director, Economic Planning and Research Division, and Mrs. Peisha Bryan Lee, Program Director, Vision 2030. At the end of the presentation, you will be able to ask your questions. Dr. Henry, the floor is yours.
Good morning, we are not hearing.
All right. All right, sorry about that. Good morning again. Are you hearing now? Yes. Before I provide the details on economic performance, let me remind you of the purpose of these quarterly economic estimates provided by the PIOJ. The PIOJ presents preliminary estimates on economic performance for each quarter. This is based on early information available from the major data providers. This release of the preliminary estimate is consistent with trends in all modern economies globally, where it is a common practice to release a first, second, and even a third preliminary estimate before the final official figures are released. The PIOJ releases the preliminary growth estimate approximately 6 weeks following the end of the quarter being reviewed. Statin releases the official GDP figures at the end of the third month following the end of the quarter. The targeted timeline for the press briefing is sometimes impacted by challenges in the data collection process. For the review period, January to March 2021, measures implemented to stem the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic also impacted the timeliness of data flow from the key providers. The release of the preliminary outturn information is used by various stakeholders, including our international development partners, the private sector, as well as the government, to inform critical planning and policy-related decisions. I would also like to reiterate that trends have shown that the gap between our initial estimate and the subsequent estimate produced by Statin is more likely to be larger in times of extraordinary shocks, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic. That is, the variation between PIOJ's estimate and Statin's subsequent estimate is likely to be outside the usual band. Today, we are reporting that real gross domestic product, GDP, for the Jamaican economy contracted by an estimated 5.7% in the January to March 2021 quarter compared with the corresponding quarter of 2020. This outturn continues to reflect the impact of the global pandemic stemming from the spread of the novel coronavirus disease 2019, COVID-19, which has significantly impacted lives, livelihoods, and the economy in general. It is important to note, however, the gradual tempering of the rate of contraction as indicated by the preliminary outturn for this quarter. If this materializes, it would represent the lowest rate of decline since the April to June 2020 quarter. The outturn for January to March 2021 largely reflected the impact of one, an increase in the COVID-19 confirmed cases to 39,543 at the end of March 31, 2021, relative to 12,915 confirmed cases in December 2020. This represented the largest quarterly increase in COVID-19 cases quarter over quarter. Two, the implementation of measures globally and locally to manage the COVID-19 pandemic relative to the corresponding quarter of 2020, when the economy operated normally for the first 2 months. The measures implemented negatively impacted all industries associated with entertainment, transportation, and tourism due to the restrictions on international travel, as well as limits on the size of gatherings. These include the hotels and restaurants, other services, and the transportation, storage, and communication industries, which are all estimated to have recorded double-digit declines. And three, the lagged impact of adverse weather conditions in the previous quarter, which destroyed crops and delayed replanting activities during that period. The contraction in the economy was partially tempered by a relatively strong increase in construction activities, as well as increased capacity utilization in the mining and quarrying industry, following the cycling out of the impact of the closures of the Alpart refinery, which caused a drag on growth during the first 9 months of 2020. It should be noted that the construction industry was largely exempt from the COVID-19 containment measures and is the only goods producing industry to have recorded 3 consecutive quarters of economic growth. Real sector developments in the goods producing industry. The goods producing industry grew by an estimated 3% due to expansions in the mining and quarrying and construction industries. This performance largely reflected the impact of increased capacity utilization in the mining sub-industry and an uptick in building construction activities. These improved performances outweighed contractions recorded for agriculture and manufacturing. Agriculture. Output of the agriculture, forestry, and fishing industry fell by an estimated 2%. The performance of the industry partly reflected the impact of flood conditions in the previous quarter, which adversely impacted planting activities. Additionally, there was a decrease in output per hectare in domestic crop production. The other agricultural crops group was estimated to have declined by 2.1%. There were decreases in 6 of the 9 crop groups, including other tubers, down 16.8%, cereals, down 14.4%, condiments, down 11.9%, and legumes, down 5.5%. Tempering the decline in output were increases for yams, up 6.9%, and fruits, up 6.1%. Animal farming was estimated to have decreased, reflecting lower production of broiler meat, down 8.7%. The decline was, however, tempered by an increase in egg production, up 7.2%. Increases were, however, recorded for post-harvest activities and traditional export crops, largely reflecting higher production of sugarcane and cocoa. Mining and quarrying. Real value added for the mining and quarrying industry increased by an estimated 6.2%. This was due mainly to higher production of both alumina and crude bauxite. Alumina production grew by 4.5% due to higher output levels at the Jamalco plant. This was reflected in an increase of 2.3 percentage points to 44.2% in the capacity utilization rate at alumina refineries. Production of crude bauxite increased by 9.6%. The bauxite capacity utilization rate increased by 4.7 percentage points to 50%. Manufacturing. Real value added for the manufacturing industry was estimated to have contracted by 1.4%, reflecting lower output in both the food, beverages, and tobacco and other manufacturing components. With respect to food, beverages, and tobacco, lower levels of output were recorded in the food processing component, including poultry meat, down 8.7%, animal feeds, down 2.6%, edible oils, down 7.6%, and cornmeal, down 4.1%. A further decline was tempered by increases in edible fats, up 13.2%, sugar, up 15%, and molasses, up 32.7%. In the beverages and tobacco component, higher levels of production were recorded for rum and alcohol, up 20.8%, and carbonated beverages, up 0.7%. In the other manufacturing category, lower output stemmed largely from decreases in the petroleum products category. Reductions were recorded for liquid petroleum gas, LPG, down 56.5%, turbo fuel, down 67.7%, and fuel oil, down 17.2%. An increase was, however, estimated for the non-metallic minerals category, which was pushed by increases in cement, up 35.2%, and clinker, up 34.7%. Construction. Real value added for the construction industry increased by an estimated 12.6%. This reflected a 32.8% increase in preliminary sales data of construction inputs and was attributed to increased activities in both the building construction and other construction components. Real sales of construction inputs grew significantly, with wholesale of construction materials, hardware, and plumbing up 65.2%, and retail sale of paint and glass up 7.4%. The building construction component was driven by a 25.8% increase in total housing starts and a 36.4% increase in the total value of mortgages dispersed. There was an estimated increase in the other construction component, stemming from an uptick in civil engineering activities reflected in higher capital expenditure by the Jamaica Public Service, which dispersed $1.14 billion, an increase of 9.6%, National Road Operating and Construction Company, NROC, which dispersed $1.9 billion on Part A of the South Coast Highway Improvement Project, SCHIP, Maypen to Williamsfield, compared with $0.3 billion dispersed in the corresponding quarter of 2020, and the UDC, which dispersed $329.2 million on the upgrade works of the Hellshire Sewage Treatment Plant, as well as the Montego Bay Closed Harbor Beach. This represented an increase of 41.9% relative to the disbursement in the corresponding period of 2020. Developments in the services industry. The services industry was estimated to have contracted by 8.1%, largely reflecting downturns in hotels and restaurants, other services, and the transportation, storage, and communication industries. The performance of these industries was negatively impacted by the measures implemented globally and locally to manage the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly in the areas of air and land transportation, tourist accommodation, and entertainment services. Electricity and water supply. Electricity and water supply recorded an estimated contraction of 7.1% in real value added due to decreases in both electricity and water consumption. Electricity consumption declined by 8%, reflecting lower levels of consumption in all 6 categories. Residential, down 0.5%. General service, that's small businesses using less than 25 kilovolt ampere kVA, down 12.6%. Power service, that's large businesses using more than 25 kVA but less than 500 kVA, was down 10.4%. Large power, businesses using more than 500 kVA, was down 12.4%. Street lighting and other, as power interchange customers, for example, bauxite companies, was down 8.8%. And largest power, single locations that have minimum peak demand of 2,000 kVA, was down 3.9%. Water consumption decreased by 3%, reflecting lower consumption in the Western Division, down 12.1%, which outweighed increases in consumption in the Eastern Division of 1.8%. Transport, storage, and communication. Real value added for the transport, storage, and communication industry contracted by an estimated 6.6%. This resulted from a decrease in the transport and storage component, which outweighed increased activities in the communication component. The downturn in transport and storage was due to a decline in the air transport component, reflecting decreased passenger movements, down 72.1%, departures down 71.5%, and arrivals down 72.1%. Maritime transport activities grew, reflecting increased cargo movement at the Port of Kingston, up 5.6%, and outports, up 0.9%. Finance and insurance services. Real value added for the finance and insurance services industry was estimated to have contracted by 1% during the review quarter, reflecting decreases in the net interest income on the stock of loans and advances and fees and commission income. WR trim. Real value added in the wholesale and retail trade, repair and installation of machinery, WR trim industry was estimated to have declined by 3.2%. This performance was influenced by estimated contractions in the related agriculture and manufacturing industries, a decline in employment by 74,300 persons in January 2021 relative to January 2020, which curtailed domestic demand, and measures associated with the management of the COVID-19 pandemic, which reduced operational hours and restricted the movement of people. Lower sales were recorded for 6 of the 8 categories, including minerals, fuels, lubricants, and petroleum products, down 14.1%. Other wholesale and retail sales of goods and services, down 11%. And agriculture, food, beverage, and tobacco, down 6.2%. Hotels and restaurants. Real value added for the hotels and restaurants industry contracted by an estimated 56.2%, largely reflecting an estimated decline in stopover arrivals by 71.9%. There were no cruise passenger arrivals during the period, reflecting the continuation of COVID-19 containment measures. Preliminary data on tourist expenditure indicate a US $520.7 million decline to US $254.4 million, reflecting largely the decrease in the number of stopover arrivals and no cruise passenger arrivals during the review quarter. For the employment update, based on the labor force survey undertaken by the Statistical Institute of Jamaica, Statin, for the month of January 2021, the unemployment rate was 8.9%. This was 1.5 percentage points higher than the rate recorded in January 2020. The number of persons employed decreased by 74,300 persons to 1,194,800 persons relative to January 2020. There was a decrease in the labor force by 58,600 persons to 1,301,900. An examination of the employed labor force by industry group as at January 2021 revealed that 9 of the 15 industry groups recorded lower employment levels. The largest declines in employment were recorded for accommodation and food service activities, down 27,400 persons, arts, entertainment, recreation, and other services, down 18,800 persons, wholesale and retail trade, down 15,400 persons, and transport and storage down 9,900 persons. GDP performance for the fiscal year 2020-21. For fiscal year 2020-21, real GDP is estimated to have contracted by 10.8%, reflecting declines in all industries, with the exception of construction and producers of government services. The heavier weighted services industry was estimated to have declined by 12.4%, and the goods producing industry by 3.3%. The industries which recorded the largest contractions during the fiscal year were hotels and restaurants, down 65.7%, other services, down 27.2%, and transport, storage, and communication, down 13.3%. For our short-term outlook, April to June 2021 and fiscal year 2021-2022. For April to June 2021, growth prospects for the economy are generally positive. It is projected that the economy will grow within the range 7% to 9% during April to June 2021, based on the commencement of the recovery process relative to the low output levels recorded in the corresponding period of 2020, the relaxation of some COVID-19 containment measures relative to the lockdown which occurred in the corresponding quarter of 2020, and increased domestic demand due to an expected expansion in employment levels. Preliminary data for the April to June 2021 quarter has indicated some positive movements which support this projection. Airport arrivals for April 2021 totaled approximately 83,000 visitors compared to none recorded in April 2020. Water consumption for April 2021 grew by 2.2% relative to April 2020. The projection for fiscal year 2021-22 is for growth within the range of 4% to 8%. In addition to the factors expected to influence the April to June 2021 quarter, the performance of the fiscal year will be influenced by the gradual relaxation of measures globally that restrict the movement of persons as countries seek to attain herd immunity through continued rollout of vaccination programs. This augurs well for the world economy and a strengthening of external demand for Jamaica's goods and services. The upside potential and downside risks. There is upside potential and downside risks to this forecast. The main downside risks to the forecast presented include: 1, adverse weather conditions, particularly on agricultural activities; 2, the uncertainty related to the effectiveness and duration of the COVID-19 containment measures; 3, slower than anticipated pace of growth in the economies of Jamaica's main trading partners, which will negatively impact external demand; and 4, increased factory downtime associated with aged production plants. The pace of economic growth could, however, be enhanced if the following upside potential are realized. 1, stronger than anticipated global demand associated with an early rebound in global economic activities. 2, faster than expected recovery in local demand as firms rehire workers that previously lost jobs, or increases in the number of hours for workers whose hours were previously reduced. And 3, stronger domestic linkages as local firms satisfy local and global demand, which were previously fulfilled by the global supply chain. For Vision 2030 Jamaica update, before I provide an update on the country's development results, let me use this opportunity to remind you how these are measured under Vision 2030 Jamaica, the National Development Plan, NDP. Each medium-term socio-economic policy framework, or MTF, which is a central tenet of the implementation framework of Vision 2030 Jamaica, includes the national outcome indicators as well as relevant targets covering a 3-year period. The priority strategies and actions implemented under the MTF are intended to promote the achievement of the target. Fiscal year 2020-21 marked 12 years of implementation of Vision 2030 Jamaica National Development Plan through successive 3-year medium-term socio-economic policy frameworks, MTFs. In the 4th quarter of the fiscal year, there was limited access to updates to the data used to monitor performance under the national outcome indicators. Consequently, there is no update on development performance with the exception of security and safety and some development considerations. In reporting on security status, we report on the indicator category 1 crimes, which is subdivided into 2 groups. 1, serious and violent crimes, and 2, accusatory crimes, in keeping with the classifications of the Jamaica Constabulary Force. Category 1 crimes include murder, shooting, rape, aggravated assault, robbery, break-ins, and larceny. We also report on the murder rate as a separate indicator. Jamaica made gains in security and safety with category 1 crimes per 100,000 of the population in 2020 at 207.29, the lowest since plan implementation commenced in 2009, and lower than the 2007 baseline year. The 2018 target was met, and there was progress towards the 2021 target. The murder rate per 100,000 population has fluctuated over the period since 2009, with the rate recorded in most years lower than that for the 2007 baseline year. The murder rate in 2020 increased to 48.37 from 45.88 in 2019. For the quarter, January to March 2021, the category 1 crime rate was 51.16 per 100,000 population, a decrease from the 57.01 recorded for the corresponding period in 2020. The murder rate for the quarter was 13.93 per 100,000 population, a slight increase over the 13.05 recorded for the corresponding period in 2020. In terms of the impact of COVID-19 on the national development results based on preliminary data. Based on data for 2019 and 2020, Jamaica has already achieved, and in some cases, surpassed several 2021 targets, including targets for population growth, secondary level enrollment rates, case clearance rate, and annual inflation rate. Notwithstanding these successes, there have been development slippages due largely to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. While the measures employed locally to curb the spread of the virus and the ongoing vaccination program have yielded positive outcomes, the pandemic has negatively impacted development, particularly in the social and economic areas. Disruptions in economic activity in key industries have stymied economic growth and contributed to the loss of jobs and reduced work hours across several industries. The extent and nature of social dislocation will be more clearly defined as more data becomes available. At this stage, the uncertainty regarding the pathway and duration of the pandemic does not yet allow for a comprehensive assessment of the impact of the pandemic. However, the country is already experiencing some slippages which are being monitored closely. These are rising unemployment, economic contraction, fall in productivity, multidimensional pressures on the society, particularly on the most vulnerable. The results and considerations presented today will continue to play a key role in the pursuit of the strategic priorities under Vision 2030 Jamaica and inform the development of MTF 2021 to 2024. These also inform the country's fulfillment of its commitments under the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, which are being implemented through Vision 2030 Jamaica. The ongoing implementation of successive 3-year MTFs aim to consolidate the developmental gains made in the previous MTFs and strengthen the foundations for achieving the country's long-term results, considering the changing environment which presents new opportunities as well as threats. This requires strategic evidence and results-based national development planning, policy making, and programming that is adaptive, agile, people-centered, and partnership-driven to ensure that development goals are achieved and all Jamaicans equitably benefit. In conclusion, the preliminary data presented on economic performance for the January to March 2021 quarter indicate that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and associated restrictive measures continued to negatively affect growth. However, it is important to note that this impact is continuing to subside as the domestic and global economy gradually reopen. The estimated contraction of 5.7% for January to March 2021 would result in an estimated contraction for fiscal year 2020-21 of 10.8%. Going forward, in fiscal year 2021-22, it is anticipated that the economy will record economic growth in each quarter of the fiscal year. This is primarily due to the relatively low levels of output recorded in the previous fiscal year. For the April to June 2021 quarter, the economy is anticipated to grow within the range of 7% to 9%, with most industries expected to record growth. A potential upside to this forecast is the extent to which the COVID-19 measures implemented globally are relaxed, given the increased pace of rollout of vaccination programs. On the downside, the official commencement of the hurricane season in June poses a risk to economic performance, as well as a slower than expected rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine globally and locally. For fiscal year 2021-22, the economy is forecasted to grow within the range of 4% to 8%. The increase in economic activities will also support the strengthening of employment levels, with some industries expected to get closer to their pre-crisis levels. Despite the relatively strong economic performance anticipated for this fiscal year, it should be noted that a full recovery to pre-crisis levels of GDP output is not anticipated until fiscal year 2023-24, while employment levels are expected to recover to pre-crisis levels in fiscal year 2022-23. However, uncertainty regarding the pace of the relaxation of COVID-19 management measures and ultimately the pace of recovery in the global economy poses the main downside risk to this projection. Finally, short-term prospects are positive. We anticipate continued improvement as stakeholders continue to collaborate to overcome the challenges associated with the pandemic. I therefore encourage us to maintain our collaborative effort and to remain disciplined and responsible as we sustain our efforts to make Jamaica the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business. I want to acknowledge and thank the very dedicated team here at the PIOJ. May God continue to bless you. May God continue to bless Jamaica land we love. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks DG. The floor is now open for questions. Please use the raise hand icon in the chat if you have a question. After you have been identified, state your name and organization. You will then be asked to unmute your mic and open your camera if you wish to do so. So we are now open for questions. And DJ, I have a question for you from Jam Fusion Food. What is the forecast for the construction industry in the long term?
All right, thank you for that question. So as the data becomes available, we'll have more accurate forecasts going forward. But a lot of the uptick we've seen, as I said, the construction momentum has been strong. And we've seen consecutive quarters of growth in the construction industry, even while other industries have been affected negatively in the context of the pandemic. There's a typical knock-on effect to construction that once there is a construction, it could lead to boom as more and more persons, as confidence builds, as the conditions in the overall local and global environment improve, then you may see persons who are maybe still yet a little risk averse or skeptical now coming in and increasing the sort of construction momentum. So we would anticipate positive outturns for construction going forward. We can't give us exact numbers now, but certainly as we continue to monitor the environment, the economic environment, we can produce and provide some estimates going forward. James, anything you want to add? No.
Are there any other questions? Gwyneth, do you have any questions? None from Gwyneth? Okay, DG. Somebody responded in the chat room to say that construction are linked to real estate growth, but with jobs down, it implies that persons are buying these homes for investment purposes. What's your take on that, DG?
That I don't want to speculate on that at all in terms of motives for purchases or some of the activities. What we can say is that activities have been increasing. You could anticipate that if the industry continues to increase and expand in terms of activities, then you could see even more employment coming in that sector. But in terms of motives, I won't, from this position render motive and speculate as to motive. All right, but thank you for that observation. James?
No, I was just adding that although employment was down during the period, mortgages, you would have noted that mortgages was up significantly in the region of 34%, I think, for the period. So that would have supported the boom in housing developments, housing starts.
SJ had his or her hand up. SJ in the chat room, do you still want to ask a question or make a comment? There is a raised hand from Durant Pate. Can you go ahead, please unmute your mic?
Okay, morning DG, and apologies. Part of your presentation I missed because I'm driving. But my question to you is your assessment on the performance of the financial sector vis-a-vis your projections coming for the next quarter, meaning the April to June.
All right, so for finance, we said for the projection going forward, we anticipate for the April to June growth for the quarter, and with most industries growing. And that would include, we're projecting also for finance, the finance and the insurance services. All right, so again, some of that, though, relatively low base last year in terms of, the negative impact, the fallout from the pandemic, and moving beyond that. There still is, in terms of both globally and of course for us locally, still a lot of uncertainty, as you said. So we have given, in the context of projections, we've given what we call the upside, that you could see things outturn that is more positive than what we anticipate, and you can have it more negative in terms of the downside. And so there's still, the system, we would say, is still characterized by quite a bit of uncertainty. As vaccination programs, as vaccines were developed and the vaccination programs began to be rolled out, some of the uncertainty decreased, but there is still that general sense. And so it calls on all of us, globally and locally, to continue to be responsible in our behavior, so we can help to contain and overcome, as it were, this COVID-19 pandemic. All right, thank you.
I have a follow-up, if I may.
Yes, please go ahead.
Right, could, given the underlying factors in the economy, DG, why are we seeing this massive boost in the construction sector? What accounts for this optimism or renewed interest?
So that's a good question, and again, we'd probably want to delve a little more. So in some aspects, persons could, and again, no, I'm just saying broadly, some persons could have engaged. Most construction tend to be mortgages or long-term financing. So persons who engage in that can be anticipating recovery in the future in a longer term scenario. So could undertake some activities with the expectation that things would pick up as it would close out in terms of completion of activities and then begin to generate some return on those investments. So that's one, so that the nature of what they do is more long-term in some aspects. So you could find that. And then given the nature of the pandemic, even though there's uncertainty, people globally and locally, we still anticipate in the medium term some return to pre-crisis levels. So we said for GDP by 2023-24, and then for employment by 2022-23. So we are looking forward, and the nature of construction in often cases, it's a long-term undertaking. So people are looking forward into a more positive future than the current fallout of the pandemic. So that could be one, but again, we would have to delve a little more in terms of some specifics. But let me ask James Stewart to weigh in.
The only thing I would add to that, DG, is that some of this activity that we are seeing now would represent the impact of some delayed investment which took place during the heights of the pandemic in 2020. So you're seeing an uptick from that delayed decision to commence construction activities this year as opposed to 2020.
Just for me, if it was like a one-off increase, I would understand. But this increase in construction and the boom in construction has been taking place even during the pandemic. This seems to have been the only sector which is exhibiting this renewed interest.
Yeah, so I think what we've said would hold in terms of confidence and delayed activities. You heard some of the stakeholders speaking about accommodation by their financiers and a number of factors that would go in. And I think those play a part. You remember at one point we saw agriculture just at the start of the pandemic last year, the first case in Jamaica, March 2020. But as we looked at that sort of quarter, as it began to roll out and the fallout, we saw agriculture initially still doing well, because as persons ramped up in the agricultural sector, ramped up production, and particularly with the growth in tourism and that sort of long-term view, and they were doing much more. With the fallout, we could have seen a local take-up of a lot of that agricultural production. So you saw, in a sense, a pivoting where a lot of that production, the output in agriculture. So we saw agriculture initially doing well, and unfortunately they were impacted negatively by drought conditions or climate impacts, even though the pandemic still also impacted them negatively. So not just construction, but you saw where persons were before we went into the pandemic, and you've heard it being said quite a bit that Jamaica went in a relatively better position than we would have been in terms of years ago, because of the types of reforms that the economy had been going through for entrenched and stronger macro stability. We saw greater emphasis on increased competitiveness. We saw jobs and record levels of employment. So you saw quite a bit happening. And so when the pandemic came, there was some disruption, but you'd have seen some, as James Stewart said, some delay, but a lot of that momentum, a lot of those activities were already in train, and there was just a delay there, if you say a hiccup, and some of them came back on relatively quickly as they could, as I say, rearrange and restructure workout arrangements. So it's not that some of it were just coming on board, some of it was in train before. So we could continue to expand in terms of explore, and then also, as we reported, as James is reminding me, the construction industry was then exempt from some of the containment measures implemented to contain the spread of the virus, and that was very important. So that benefited the industry also. All right, so a number of factors, and at the end of the day, Durant, it all goes well for the economy.
There's another question here, DG, from Trevon Mayer. Tourism seems to be showing some bouts in recent months. Do you think what we've been seeing is sustainable? And should it be taken as a sign of possibly earlier than expected recovery of the sector? Additionally, What is the expected timeline for the return of cruise line travel?
All right, so thank you for that question, those questions. The second question, let me answer first. I don't know. You'd have to check. I'll easily refer you to the Ministry of Tourism and then use that as a segue to answer your first question, to say, from what we've seen, there's been quite a bit of leaning forward in the tourism sector, that even from the pandemic started, you saw quite a bit of activity to try to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on the sector. You saw quite a bit of outreach in terms of continued marketing, even promoting Jamaica as a safe destination, anticipating recovery. So, a lot of activities that we think very commendable in sort of positioning Jamaica as a tourism destination, anticipating better conditions and a recovery. And so we know that's been underpinned by our overall strategic plan for the recovery of the sector that's underway in terms of development. And a lot is being advanced in the sector. So I think that says a lot. And we know they are very active there trying to safeguard and promote Jamaica as a resilient destination, showcasing our concern for safety, our concern for life and livelihoods, and positioning the destination as such. So I think we saw something similar in the 2008 crisis when we had the 2008 to 2012 global financial crisis and economic crisis. You saw sort of a leaning forward again, that tourism was doing relatively better than many of our other destinations in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And we think a lot of it was just a sort of anticipation, a strategic getting in front of the issue, and a lot of emphasis on resilience and showcasing Jamaica as a resilient destination. So I think that's very commendable. Again, the area of broader concern of global recovery, as you know, tourism is dependent on that. And so we've highlighted those aspects even to the forecast. So those remain real, but I think a lot of commendations to what we've been seeing in terms of the leadership and activities in the sector.
Thanks, DG. SJ, do you still want to ask your question? You had your hand up.
Can you hear me?
Can you identify yourself, your organization, and go ahead?
Stephen Jackson from the Gleaner. All right, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, sure. Morning, everybody. So the inputs to the construction sector, particularly lumber, cement, so certainly lumber has increased over 250% year on year. And other key inputs have also increased. And my question is really in relation to, with the continued growth on the construction sector, what's the likely impact to inflation based on this these inputs?
All right, thanks, Stephen. And like the question on tourism and cruise passenger arrivals, on matters of inflation, of course, we would refer you to BOJ, the Bank of Jamaica, which has been now engaged in this new paradigm of inflation targeting and doing quite a bit. And they've estimated a band and forecast their band for inflation. And you'd have heard in their own briefing, the governor and the team express their own confidence in those targets. And so I'd refer you to specifics on inflation to them. Albeit to say that as you see increased demand in a sector, then you could see some of the price movements reflecting that, which is quite normal.
And just for my own edification.
So, quite normal what you're seeing, and of course your question as the anticipated impact. Referring to the BOG.
Well, just for my own edification, could you remind us the impact on the real estate sector, construction sector back in the 2008-2009 fallout? Was there did the construction sector also rise when the economy was experiencing a recession?
contracted. So let me ask James Stewart to respond, Steve. Thank you.
Thanks.
No, during that time, the construction sector contracted. The only industry which we had growing throughout that time was the hotels and restaurants, remained buoyant throughout the period of that crisis. But construction definitely contracted during that time.
Interesting.
And thanks, Stephen. And since you're on construction, Mr. Stewart, this came from Rayon Markland on YouTube. Do you think this continued boom in the construction industry will continue for much longer with the increased prices across various building materials?
A lot of these, as DG alluded to before, a lot of these activities being undertaken now, they are long-term decisions which have been taken some time before, mortgages approved, etc., decision on investment taken. So we see, at least for the short to medium term, some continued growth in the construction industry. Yes, the impact, there may be an impact from prices, but a lot of these projects, decisions have already been taken. And as such, we expect to see continued boom in the short to medium term for this industry.
Thanks, Mr. Stewart. Another question. Can you speak to what factors are noted to have resulted in the hotel and restaurant industry experiencing the slight decline from the October to December 2020 and the January to March 2021 estimates?
So for some aspect, we had started recovery in terms of reopening, and so overall the sector, hotels and restaurants, are the hardest hit in terms of assessment because of the nature of the pandemic. And as Stephen asked a question before, in terms of in the 2008 crisis, we are not surprised that construction declined also, because if you recall, the nature of that crisis was largely in the financial sector, the subprime industries, and you saw a hit there. So especially a sector like industry that construction would rely heavily on financing and more patient or long-term financing, and you'd expect some fallout there. In the nature of this pandemic is large, because of the nature of the pandemic, measures to mitigate would include restricting the movement of people, both, of course, locally and cross-border. And right away, you would realize that would negatively impact tourism extremely heavily, because by the nature of tourism, we rely a lot on cross-border movements and a lot of our visitors. And while for agriculture, you could pivot some of your markets from the tourism sector to meeting local demand. And yes, in tourism, you could have some local persons, Jamaicans, utilizing the facilities and enjoying the tourism product, which is an ongoing feature. The larger numbers, and particularly in terms of earnings, would come from abroad. So that's what you would have seen. And so the fallout has been very severe for the sector, because you're not just talking about air passenger arrival, but cruise also, and a lot of the sector would depend on that. So we can delve into any fluctuations in terms of specifics, but I think that's generally what you'd have seen. We had a full lockdown for some months, for some time last year, and then we had a gradual reopening as of June. We had a gradual reopening of the economy, and we began to see some slight uptick, but not sufficient to begin to reverse some of those outturns that we saw, the negative outturns. So we are hoping that the projection is, we are, as we say, we are for the short, medium term going forward, a positive outlook, subject to the risk that we've outlined.
Thanks, DG. Mr. Pate, your hand is up. Can you go ahead with your question?
Okay, one final question for you, DG. Been listening carefully, and it's all positive for you. And the question is now, based on what you are seeing, is the recovery in the economy better than earlier projected or initiated?
It's about the same. Huh? It's about the same. So if you would, for Durant, you've been following our coverage, if you will, and our assessments, you would see that we did project recovery, and we did anticipate, and we did see, and we've continued to see, and that's still the case, that there is still uncertainty around, because even while vaccination programs are being rolled out, there is still uncertainty. It is based on also human behavior, which is why we continue to add our voice to the call for responsible behavior, for discipline. And so I think it's very important. We had said that, and from last year, we were giving the projections, we say we anticipate return to pre-crisis levels of GDP in 2023-24, fiscal year 23-24, and that's been consistent. We've said that we anticipate return to pre-crisis levels of employment by 2022-23. So that's been consistent. Now obviously, the challenge with forecasts is dependent on data. And as we get more data, as we move closer to a target point, obviously you'll have more data, and your assessment can be even richer. But much to the credit, and obviously for me to say it, you say, well, I'm biased, but I invite you to look at the outturn of what we forecasted and the actual outturn in the economy. Extremely close, but we've made a caveat that says in times of crisis, in extraordinary deviation, simply because there's much more noise. So I continue to credit the team here at PIOJ for doing such a tremendous job of being robust in terms of estimates. So we've been consistent, just to make that point. But again, if you look at our colleagues internationally, the Global Forum, you look at the IMF, different ones who monitor the international space, you've seen where they're projected, and because issues arise, a second wave in some of the leading economies, a third wave, they revise the forecast. And that's the nature of what we do. And so we're just giving you that context to help you in terms of expectation. But there's a lot of comfort that I have in terms of the numbers as we anticipate the projections that we give. And we are assured, and we assure the Jamaican public, that we continue to monitor. And we are part of a team, the PIOJ, along with, on the monetary side, the BOJ, the Ministry of Finance. Statin generates a lot of data. And these are challenging contexts in which it's hard to do face-to-face to generate surveys. So it's a challenging context. And I must commend, I think, the overall economic management of the country of doing so well in a context of challenge. And so just to make that point, so we still stand by what we are saying, but it's not, how do you say that? It's a robust and dynamic process. So we just continue to do that and wish, and, we are optimistic. Yes, somebody said, well, you're always positive. Well, with reason. So it's really informed, and you hear us speak about results and evidence-based decisions. So we're looking at the numbers. And we're continue to safeguard and really promote and promulgate the integrity of the data and what we estimate and project. All right, so thank you for that.
Thank you, DG. I think we have come to the end of our questions session. I would just like to thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Today's presentation will be on our YouTube channel. That's the full presentation. The DG's speech will be on our website, and also summaries on our social media pages. Join us again in August for a report on the April to June period. Stay safe and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Yes, it was DG.